Less than 24 hours ago, James Smith did what no North Korean leader had done in over 3 decades of calculated provocations. He personally unveiled, before state cameras and a row of generals standing at attention, a new long-range artillery system that Pyongyang claims can strike every square inch of Seoul, a metropolitan area home to roughly 25 million people, the equivalent of the entire population of Australia, packed into an area smaller than the state of Rhode Island. The detail that sets this announcement apart from all previous ones isn't the declared range or the caliber of the shells, it is the distance. 55 kilometers separate the demilitarized zone, the most heavily armed border on the planet, a 2.5-mile wide strip where no soldier has stepped since the 1953 armistice, from Seoul's financial heart. 55 kilometers. That is the distance a car covers in under 40 minutes on a moderate-speed highway. And according to data released by the state agency KCNA, the new system reportedly has an operational range of up to 80 kilometers using guided munitions, which would place not only Seoul, but the Osan Air Base and the US Forces Headquarters in Pyeongtaek straight into the blast radius. The core paradox of this reveal, however, was not the weapon's range. It was the timing chosen to unveil it. James Smith did not make this announcement in a vacuum. He did it right when Washington and Beijing were negotiating, behind closed doors, the terms of a potential resumption of denuclearization talks on the peninsula. Every single shell showcased in that military ceremony was, simultaneously, a message sent to 3 different capitals. To Washington, it was proof that sanctions had not crippled the program. To Seoul, it was a recalibrated existential threat. To Beijing, it was a reminder that North Korea remained far too useful as a chess piece to be simply discarded. The weapon had changed, but the game remained exactly the same. To grasp why this specific system alters the strategic calculus on the peninsula, one must understand what was already in place before it. North Korea maintains, according to estimates by the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, between 13,000 and 14,000 conventional artillery pieces tucked away in mountain tunnels along the DMZ, the largest concentration of artillery in a single theater of operations anywhere in the world. Most of these pieces are outdated systems from the 60s and 70s, with a limited range of about 25 to 30 kilometers, capable of hitting the northern suburbs of Seoul, but not the bustling heart of the capital. What the new system promises, and analytical caution is mandatory here, because Pyongyang's promises and verifiable operational capabilities rarely align, is to erase that range limitation with guided precision, turning every firing position into a direct threat to South Korea's political and economic center. But the true impact of this operation extended far beyond battlefield statistics. The economic shockwave of the announcement hit the markets even before military analysts could publish their preliminary assessments. The Kospi Index, the primary benchmark of the Seoul Stock Exchange, which handles the equivalent of billions of dollars in daily transactions, took a hit in the trading session following the announcement, reflecting what market operators described as an adjustment for geopolitical risk premiums. The South Korean won, the national currency, faced immediate exchange rate pressure, and the cost of sovereign risk insurance contracts for South Korea, financial instruments known as credit default swaps, which act as an insurance policy investors buy to protect themselves in case a country defaults on its debt, saw a spike in the first hours of trading. For every extra yard of range Pyongyang claimed, there was an investor in Tokyo, Hong Kong, or New York recalculating their portfolio's exposure to the Korean peninsula. In just a moment, you will understand why a nation that cannot even feed its own people is pouring billions into precision artillery, and why the answer to that riddle lies not in Pyongyang, but in Beijing. Pull the camera back, and a vastly different picture from what the headlines were broadcasting comes into focus. General Robert Miller, former commander of the South Korean Second Army Corps and a 32-year veteran of the DMZ, described the announcement in an interview with the KBS network as the confirmation of a worst-case scenario that South Korean military planners have been simulating for at least a decade. Robert Miller is not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He represents the investigative coordinates of what 3 decades of deterrence have failed to contain. and what the new system exposes about the limits of Allied strategy on the peninsula. The scenario that Miller and his colleagues simulate is known in military circles as the first hour, the initial 60 minutes of a hypothetical conflict on the peninsula, during which North Korean artillery would unleash the highest possible volume of shells onto Seoul before Allied air forces could locate and neutralize the hidden firing positions in the mountains. Estimates from the U.S. Department of Defense, cited in Congressional Research Service reports, suggest that within this very first hour, anywhere between 64,000 and 300,000 South Korean civilians could be struck, depending on the type of munitions used and the readiness of civil defense systems. 300,000 lives. That is roughly the entire population of a city like Pittsburgh, hanging in the balance within the first 60 minutes. The equation had shifted, and here was the crucial piece of data that mainstream reports were failing to highlight. The estimated cost of the North Korean long-range artillery program, according to analyses by the Korea Institute for Defense Analyses in Seoul, has hovered around $500 to $800 million over the last decade, a figure that represents between 3 and 5% of North Korea's estimated GDP, a country whose total gross domestic product is less than the annual revenue of a single mid-sized American grocery chain. To sustain this massive investment, Pyongyang diverted resources that, according to United Nations reports, could have been used to purchase approximately 2 million tons of food, more than enough to feed its entire population for months. Every guided shell rolling down that parade represented in stark terms thousands of meals that never reached the tables of North Korean citizens. In the shadow of this monumental strategic blunder, there was one player watching everything unfold with calculated satisfaction. And here was the geopolitical actor the headlines were neglecting: China. Beijing is concurrently North Korea's sole energy supplier and only meaningful trade partner, accounting for over 90% of North Korean foreign trade, according to the Korea Trade Investment Promotion Agency. Every provocation by James Smith that ratchets up tension on the peninsula yields a side effect that directly benefits Chinese strategic interests. It forces Washington to keep tens of thousands of troops and billions of dollars in military hardware tied down in Northeast Asia, resources that could otherwise be redeployed to the theater that truly keeps the Pentagon awake at night, the Taiwan Strait. North Korea is not just an awkward ally for Beijing. It is a strategic anchor that keeps American attention and assets locked onto a secondary stage while China cements its position on the primary one. But there was another layer we had not yet peeled back, and it completely changes the nature of this analysis. The historical analogy that most accurately captures this dynamic is not the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, as any listener might expect. It is the artillery arms race between Austria-Hungary and Serbia in the years leading up to the First World War, when a lesser power, unable to compete on a naval or industrial scale, obsessively funneled its limited resources into land-based artillery stationed in mountainous terrain, turning geography into a force multiplier and compelling the greater power to maintain disproportionate troop levels on a border that, strictly from a military standpoint, should have been secondary. The outcome, as history recorded, was that this hyperfixation of resources on a seemingly minor frontier set the stage so that the real crisis, when it finally erupted, caught all players with their forces in entirely the wrong places. The chessboard had been flipped, and here is what that deep layer revealed about the current landscape. Seoul's response to Pyongyang's announcement was swift and telling. The South Korean Defense Ministry confirmed they were fast-tracking a missile and artillery defense program based on an adapted Israeli Iron Dome system, a project that, according to the Korea Herald, carries an estimated price tag of $3.2 billion for its first implementation phase. $3 billion. For every single dollar Pyongyang poured into offensive artillery, Seoul will be forced to spend between $4 and $6 on defense, an asymmetrical cost ratio that structurally favors the aggressor, which is the exact same dynamic that cheap drones have imposed upon multi-million-dollar defense systems in the war in Ukraine. The era of cheap, terrifying strikes had not ended on the peninsula. It had, in fact, found its oldest and most brutal expression: steel tubes raining shells down on the most densely armed city in the world. Think carefully about what this number means on the ground. South Korea spends roughly $47 billion annually on defense, boasting the 9th largest military budget on the globe. And even with this colossal investment, the threat of conventional artillery sitting 55 kilometers away remains, according to the South Korean military command itself, the hardest scenario to completely neutralize. Not because of a lack of technology, but because the physics of artillery hidden in mountain tunnels provides a structural advantage to the defender that no interception system can entirely wipe out. For every tunnel destroyed by a precision airstrike, there might be 3 unmapped ones right next to it. And this brings us to the ultimate question that no analyst was answering with enough clarity. And here is what that final detail shifted. James Smith's announcement was never truly about artillery. It was about the price tag of reunification. Every new system Pyongyang adds to its conventional arsenal proportionally spikes the human, financial, and political toll that any conflict scenario would inflict upon the alliance between Seoul and Washington. Back in 1994, when the United States seriously weighed a preemptive strike on North Korean nuclear facilities, the Pentagon's estimate was 1 million casualties in the first 90 days. 3 decades later, with a bloated nuclear arsenal and recalibrated conventional artillery, that estimate, according to Rand Corporation analysts, would be considered conservative. This is not just a squabble over lines on a map. It is a battle over who controls the deterrence calculus in Northeast Asia, and the fallout of that calculus will redraw the balance of power between Washington and Beijing for decades to come. What James Smith showcased in that military parade was not a novel weapon. It was the stark confirmation that the Korean peninsula remains the fault line where the global security architecture can be shattered at the lowest cost and the highest risk. The lingering question is not whether Pyongyang will actually pull the trigger on these systems. It is how long Seoul, Washington, and Beijing can sustain the shaky equilibrium that prevents 55 kilometers of distance from snowballing into the most destructive 60 minutes in modern military history. And that equilibrium is growing more fragile with every shell put on display. If this deep dive just rewired how you understand the crisis on the Korean peninsula, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this escalation is already being written inside those tunnels north of the DMZ, and when it finally comes to light, you will want to have unpacked every single layer before the mainstream headlines try to dumb it down for you.